Hello everyone, this is my chapters 3 and 4 discussion. I'll start with the chapter 3 questions. I chose number 1 that says, using the concept of systemic racism as discussed in our text, explain how racism in the criminal justice system affects Black and Latino immigrants. So as I stated in my last video discussion, systemic racism um, was defined by Joe Fegan in Chapter 2 as a diverse assortment of racist practices encompassing daily microaggressions, deep-seated inequalities, historical inequalities, and anti-Black ideologies. And I think these deep-seated inequalities are involved in all levels of the criminal justice system. As stated back in Chapter 2, Black people are more likely to get arrested than white people, and typically can serve longer time than white people. And I think this is because of these deep-seated and historical inequalities. There's also been many studies that show that Black people are even more likely to get pulled over than white people. So even before they've been charged with a crime, they're kind of being treated unfairly. And then as they move through the criminal justice system, they continue to be treated less than white people with their sentencing and with which jail they're put into, and how they're treated in jail or prison. And then after they get released from the criminal justice system, these things can kind of still follow them. If they have a conviction on their record, they can struggle with finding work or a place to live or a good community to be a part of. And then if that conviction was wrongfully or racistly backed, then that just adds to the pain. And then things like this kind of fuel the cycle and continues to make life more difficult for people of color. I then chose question 3, which says, using your text as the primary resource, explain how proponents of California's Proposition 187 relied on racial imagery to promote the bill. Is the bill relevant today even though it was never implemented? Why or why not? So on page 79, now in chapter 3 of our textbook, it states that these fears, the fears about the increase in Mexican population, were made worse with terms like illegals and criminals. And then it also says that supporters of Proposition 187 often took the fact that undocumented migrants came here illegally, so they are more prone to criminal activity in general. And I think this proposition is still relevant even though it wasn't implemented, because even though it wasn't implemented, it still put these thoughts into Americans' heads that illegal immigrants are criminals, and these thoughts have been passed down through generations. Typically referring to immigrants with darker skin color, because we often don't see these people making such harsh claims about European immigrants. And since immigration is becoming such a hot topic in these last few years, people, I think, started reverting back to these ideas that we're seeing in Proposition 187. And I think they're using these beliefs as reasons why we shouldn't allow immigration, which is pretty unfair because the ideas in this proposition aren't facts at all, but just images that were put into white Americans' heads to scare them into the belief that immigration will be harmful to their community. And then I chose question 5 from chapter 3 to answer, which says, we learn in chapter 3 that any discourse about immigration today has the subtext of minority incorporation into society. Considering this stance, make a claim about the role of immigration policy in creating and reproducing racial inequality. So I think with strict immigration laws, people will continue to think that Americans are superior, and that we can't let anyone else in because they're all criminals and lower than us. And I'm not going to get too political, and I certainly don't think we should just let anyone and everyone into the U.S., but I think if we don't let anybody across the borders, then these racial inequalities will never change. By not letting anyone in, it will make all the white Americans believe that their ideas, that all these immigrants are criminals and bad people, it's just going to make them think that they were right and think that the government knows this, and that that they were right all along, and that we shouldn't let anybody else in. So on to chapter 4 questions. I chose number 1. Using the text, identify and discuss a specific example where an African American athlete's behavior is depicted differently than her or his white counterpart who engaged in the same behavior. Explain how this different depiction shapes the U.S. racial order. So in our textbook in chapter 4, it uses the example of Christian Peter, who's a white football player who beat a white woman and the news of this event only reached the other people in his town or the town where it occurred in Lincoln, Nebraska. So it wasn't made that they didn't make that big of a deal out of it. But then when Lawrence Phillips, who's a black football player, beat his white ex-girlfriend, it made national news, and it even appeared on 60 Minutes. And what both of these men did was very wrong, and they should be punished. But I think they should be given equal treatment because they did commit the same crime. And the media was only showing what the black man did, and by doing this, it just reinforces the stereotype of black men being more aggressive and that whites are the superior race and that they would never do something like that. And events like these occur all the time in the modern world. I can think of many times I've seen on the news that an athlete has been arrested, and 9 times out of 10 when you look at it, it's always a black athlete that makes the news, when really white athletes break the law and get arrested just as much. And I chose question 2, using the course text define enlightened racism and provide a concrete example from current news. So the text states that enlightened racism is the idea that the United States is a land of opportunity and that African Americans could do better if they only tried harder. And I was looking for a good modern day example of this, and all that kept popping up when I looked it up, that I thought would still add to information to this chapter and make sense, was an article about the Cosby Show, so I'll put the link to that below my video. And their main argument in that article was that the Cosby Show, that showing African American family on primetime TV gave a false image of what African American life was like in the United States, and it gave white people the belief that everything in the black community was fine because they saw this higher class black family on TV, and they just expected every black family to be like that. So it gave all those watching, especially the white people, a false belief that African Americans are well off in society, and didn't present any other situations that may be facing African Americans in the real world as well. And then the last question I chose to talk about was question 4 from chapter 4, which says, define controlling images, select a common racial stereotype promoted by the media, and use the concept of controlling images to explain how the stereotype justifies and reinforces inequality. So I think the common stereotype that blacks are thieves, which is promoted a lot in the news, is a good example. When the headlines all say black man steals from store, or when they see like store broken into, and then they almost always show a black man. And this kind of leads people to believe that white men don't steal from stores, which I hope we all know is not true. Where I live, I'd say the white people are the ones causing problems in our town more than anybody else. But this is what controlling images mixed with the media is putting into people's heads, that these black people are the ones in the wrong. And news outlets are only going to provide the news that will get them the most ratings. So when you have a news network that's primarily watched by white people, they know their ratings won't do very well if they just release all this news that's showing all the bad things white people do, because then that's not going to be good for their viewers. I think that's pretty much it for this discussion. So thank you for watching, and I'm looking forward to watching your guys' videos as well. Thank you.